Lincoln did not exactly start out as a believer, certainly not a standard believer, and he ends up as a profound Christian believer. So, did you know this about his faith when you decided to write the book on the second inaugural? Did you already know this and then decide to write about it?
I did not. I was struck by the second inaugural, and my academic colleagues said, well, don't get too excited. Presidents always reference the Bible in their inaugural addresses. So I said, well, let's read the previous 18 addresses. The Bible had been mentioned one time by John Quincy Adams. So this was quite surprising to that audience. He was on a faith journey. You and I are on journeys in our life, and I thought that the average historian didn't give Lincoln any credit for changing his mind about faith.
Welcome to Socrates in the City. Thank you for coming. I'm very excited, so excited to be in the Lincoln Library because we're going to be talking about Abraham Lincoln tonight. Some of you know that our guest tonight is Ronald C. White. His new book is called On Great Fields, about Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. I'm going to make my introduction particularly brief because we have so much to talk about. I want to talk about two books tonight. Dr. Ronald White has written many books. The new one, On Great Fields, about Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, and the one that came out in 2009 about Abraham Lincoln. But we are in the Lincoln Library. There's a lot of Lincoln memorabilia here. I think Lincoln's rookie glove is in a case back there someplace. Let me just tell you the tiniest bit about Ronald White. It's very rare as the author of books to find that the flap copy really does a good job. That's rare. So the flap copy did such a good job, I thought I would simply read it. Ronald C. White is the New York Times bestselling author of the biographies A. Lincoln and American Ulysses, about Ulysses Grant, as well as 3 other books on Lincoln, most recently Lincoln in Private. White earned his PhD at Princeton. He's lectured at the White House, not the actual White House, right? Just a White House. The actual White House. The actual White House. I had no idea. That's very impressive. He's spoken about Lincoln across the world. He's a senior fellow of the Trinity Forum in Washington, D.C. It's a joy to welcome as my guest, Dr. Ronald C. White. Ronald White, welcome. I have read these books, and I'm excited to talk to you about both of them. So this is a little bit of a problem. So why don't we start with the most recent one. Now, it's rare, speaking as an author of 3 biographies, it's rare that the name of the author on the cover of the biography is way larger than the name of the subject, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, which is in mouse type. It's 6-point type on here. I think part of the reason for that, because I'm only half joking as usual, is because Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain is not so well known, and you are rather well known as a biographer. I read this book and I thought to myself, as someone who's written biographies, the idea of writing a biography, choosing someone as a subject for a full-length biography, it's not a small thing. It's you really want to make sure, obviously, you choose wisely because you're going to spend so much time. So let's start there. What led you to pick a reasonably obscure figure? He's not obscure to Civil War buffs by no means. He's not obscure to people who live in Maine. But for most people, they don't really know who Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain is. What led you to choose to write this biography?
Do you want me to be honest?
Not really. Not really.
I was speaking one evening at the Jonathan Club in Los Angeles. I live in Pasadena. And audiences, I'd written my Grant biography, and audiences always say, "And what is your next book?" And somewhat flippantly, I said, "Well, I'm not exactly sure. Does anybody have any ideas?" And this gentleman, Mark Lippis, I found, stood up in the back of the room and literally shouted, "Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain." Well, then I took this to my publisher, my agent, and we said, "Wonderful. Here's a person who, as you suggest, is well known by the Civil War buffs, but deserves to be better known by the larger public." So this is why I chose him, and I must say I had a love affair with writing this biography.
It's hard. I mean, having read it now, it's almost more difficult to ask you questions about it because he is such a great figure. It's such an astonishing thing. So having read about him, having read your book now, I don't wonder why so much you chose to write about him. But give us just the thumbnail of what people would know about him if they know anything about him. Give us the Gettysburg heroism piece.
Well, what they know about him is what I would call a zoom lens. On the second day of Gettysburg, he was asked to defend the far left line of the Union Army. He was leading the 20th Maine Volunteer Regiment at Little Round Top. And as he tried to defend this, suddenly his men ran out of ammunition. And a much larger force from Alabama and Texas came up that hill, and he offered but one word, bayonet. And they charged down the hill and defeated this larger force. And ever after, he became called the hero of Little Round Top. But my understanding was we needed what I call a wide-angle view of Chamberlain. He did more things than any other Union Civil War veteran, even more than Grant. He became professor, governor of Maine 4 times, president of Bowdoin College, incredible lecturer. He was professor of rhetoric, but he went to Bowdoin College. He had the problem of stammering. He was a stutterer, and he becomes professor of rhetoric. And then a great writer. His best book was published 1 year after his death, The Passing of the Armies. Just an amazing figure who knew 9 languages.
Okay, I want to start. I want to start there. As someone who's actually written biographies myself, it's fascinating to read your biographies. I read your long biography, amazing book on Lincoln, and more recently this book. And what you do, and you make a big point of this, you've spoken about this, that you want to tell not just kind of the highlights, but you tell the whole story of your subject's childhood and growing up. And the two things that staggered me, apart from his profound Christian faith, amazing faith, but he's clearly a ridiculous genius. I mean, he was fluent in 9 languages. So just that alone, he's a savant. He's not just some guy who went to Bowdoin. But one of the things that struck me early on in his Bowdoin career, this is long before he goes off to the Civil War and becomes this hero, was his encounter with another profoundly central figure of the 19th century and the Civil War, ultimately, Harriet Beecher Stowe. Say a little bit about that, because that just astonished me.
Well, I tried to picture him in far northern Maine, not really in encountering the big issues happening in the 1850s. And then Calvin Stowe, an alumnus of the college, is called back to teach religion. His wife is Harriet Beecher Stowe. And one Sunday morning at what was called First Parish, she literally had a vision that she had to write about these runaway enslaved persons who she had met when she lived with her father in Cincinnati. So she goes home, and on her kitchen table, she starts writing what becomes Uncle Tom's Cabin. She doesn't know it will become Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's firstly serialized in a magazine. So she invites the students into her home on Saturday evening to listen to her read parts of her book. And Chamberlain is one of those students. So I think this is the first time that Chamberlain has really heard of this story. And it begins, I don't want to overemphasize the importance of it, but it begins to lift up his own understanding of this larger American issue. Yeah.
I mean, it is just crazy that he finds himself, I don't know, 19 years old, sitting there with Harriet Beecher Stowe reading the first chapters of the book that no one dreamt would be a big deal.
Right.
No one in 1850 knew that this would be the book that, in Lincoln's words, started this little war, where you're the little lady.
One day she came to visit him, and Lincoln says, "So you're the little woman that started this big war."
Right. So Chamberlain, he's a genius. He has this encounter with Harriet Beecher Stowe, and here's the first draft of Uncle Tom's Cabin, the seminal work. But he's famous because in his 30s, when he could have stayed home, he chooses to go. Tell us this piece of it, because it's the idea that he didn't need to go. He was old enough. He could have
stayed home.
Stayed in Maine.
Well, the war broke out, as we all know, at Fort Sumter in April of 1861. There were no electives in colleges in the 19th century, so he would have known every single student who signed up for the Union Army, 2 signed up for the Confederate Army. He corresponds with them. He knows they've been captured. Some have been killed. In July of 1862, Lincoln offers the proclamation, we need 300,000 more men. Within 2 weeks, Chamberlain volunteers. Governors in those days were looking for important people who would have the ability to raise a 1,000-man regiment. So the governor is thrilled when Chamberlain enlists. He said, "I'm going to make you colonel of the regiment." This is the leader of the regiment. And Chamberlain says, "No, don't do that. I don't deserve it. I have no military training." He said, "But I will learn and earn my way one day to the command." So he starts out, by his own admission, at a lower rank, and that's the beginning of his military career. He was married to Frances Caroline Adams, who we may want to talk about here, and he had 2 young children. He was 33 years old, so no one would have faulted him to stay home. He did not have to enlist, but he did.
You said he was 33 when he enlisted.
When he enlisted.
And he obviously was already somewhat of a celebrated figure, that the governor would reach out to him expecting that because of who he was, he would be able to lure 1,000 soldiers to join him.
Absolutely, yeah.
But characteristically, he's so humble. He's such a true man of integrity and faith that he says, "No, I will not take the colonelcy."
Yeah.
And he's under Ames, right? Tell us a little bit about how it goes.
Well, he says to the governor, he says, "This war, in a sense, cannot be fought by boys. It can only be fought by men who are willing to sacrifice all that they have for the Union." We have such a hard time understanding the Union. This was not simply a political reality, it was kind of religious reality. The Union meant so much to these people. They were willing to sacrifice everything they had, and so was Chamberlain.
Now, when we say the Union, they really meant America.
They meant America, but remember before Lincoln, we all said the United States are, because in many ways the state was really the largest reality, most important. Lincoln changed the language, and now without even thinking about it, we say the United States is. So Chamberlain understood the United States is. It had to be the entire Union held together. Yeah.
Well, so he's the hero of Gettysburg, the hero of Little Round Top, because he, in this moment, I mean, you talk about a true leader, he says bayonets, and they manage to succeed. It's extraordinary. But what amazed me is that he goes on and on and on to do other heroic things in the war. He could have effectively retired on those laurels alone. So tell us more about what happens.
Well, 10 months later, in the battle for Petersburg, he is leading his men down a hill facing incredible firepower from the Confederates, and suddenly he is hit in his left side by a minie ball that passes through his body, severs blood vessels, scrapes his bladder and urethra, and stays inside his right hip. And 2 doctors tell him he will die. And he believes that, and he accepts that verdict. But then his younger brother, Tom, who's in the 20th Maine, finds two other surgeons who find him, and he is actually saved in this battle. But I want to read something that says so much about him, if I may. Believing that he is dying, this is the letter that he writes to his wife. My darling wife, I am lying mortally wounded, the doctors think, but my mind and heart are at peace. Jesus Christ is my all-sufficient Savior. I go to him. God bless and keep and comfort you, precious one. You have been a precious wife to me. To know and love you makes life and death beautiful. Cherish the darlings and give my love to all the dear ones. Do not grieve too much for me. We shall all soon meet. Live for the children. Amazing. Contemporary physicians would tell us that he had a 10% chance of survival. 10%. But the two doctors from the 20th Maine come, they extract the bullet, but for the rest of his life, he lives with this incredible internal wound that is infected over and over and over again. 3 times he has surgery, but it can never be repaired. I visited and spoke at Bowdoin College in November and visited once again his remarkable home, and he has a couch there in his study where he was president of the college. He literally couldn't sit in a chair. He would actually lie on that couch and greet visitors who came to be with him. Just amazing what he endured with those wounds.
This book, the story, it just made me think, about why we do Socrates in the City, about the meaning of life. This man was an extraordinary man. There's just no denying it. And he willingly gave his life to a greater cause. And there's such tremendous nobility in it. And the way that he suffered, it's very moving and inspiring. He even after what you just described, here now, first he's the hero of Little Round Top. So you're done. You're a Civil War legend. You're a hero. No, he goes back, and you said it was Battle of Petersburg? Okay. And now he is wounded, horribly wounded, should die. He goes back.
They send him home to recuperate when he finally gets out of the hospital in Annapolis, and his mother says to him, "Don't you think you've offered enough?" He said, "No, I've signed up for 3 years." He couldn't even mount a horse, but he goes back to serve again. And then at the end of the war, General Ulysses S. Grant asked him, a non-West Pointer, to receive the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia.
This is, it's like a greatest hits reel. You can't make this stuff up. He fights again and again. We don't have time to get into it right now, but he keeps going back and going back. And at the end of the war, and we're going to get to this when we talk about your Lincoln book, but, finally, we get Ulysses S. Grant, thank the Lord. And when the war is finally over, I couldn't believe it when I read it, that Chamberlain had risen in the eyes of so many, including Ulysses S. Grant, that he was chosen at Appomattox Courthouse to be the one to oversee. I don't know how you describe it. What was it exactly that he was chosen? But I just thought, this is extraordinary. What a picture, because we often hear about Appomattox Courthouse, but the idea that he was the one chosen. Was Grant not there?
Grant and Lee had already left, and so there's a prickly part of writing this biography. There are critics who say that Chamberlain might have embellished what he did. So I went to Appomattox Courthouse, talked with Patrick Schroeder, the park historian who's investigated this story for the last 25 years. There's no written order saying Chamberlain will lead this surrender, but my teacher at Princeton University, Jim McPherson, said, well, everything wasn't written down in the last 24 to 48 hours of the war. So Chamberlain is asked to lead the surrender. He knows that Grant has offered this magnanimous peace to Lee. What will he do? So John Brown Gordon in Lee's army, just like Chamberlain, who had risen from being a volunteer, he leads his men forward. And as they come forward, to the surprise of the Confederate soldiers, suddenly Chamberlain changes the structure of his arms to salute the Confederate army as it comes forward. It's very important in the controversies of our time to understand what was he saluting. He wasn't saluting the Confederacy. He wasn't saluting their cause. He was saluting the courage of the Confederate soldiers. The courage of the soldiers. And that would be something he would say over and over and over. I do not support the cause. I do not support the Confederacy, but I support the courage of the soldiers. Hard to say that sometimes today.
Well, his magnanimity is very moving. You're getting choked up. I get choked up. It's very, very moving. When you think that the hell that these soldiers go through, and that he had the dignity to do that. It wasn't well received by some of the Confederates, as you mentioned.
Right.
But it's very moving. It's very beautiful. And of course, it reminds us of Lincoln's words. Maybe you can remind us of Lincoln's words.
With malice toward none, with charity for all. The last words of the second inaugural address. Yeah.
What do you know about the second inaugural address? Actually, the reason I know about you, Dr. Ron C. White, is because a mutual friend of ours, Talmadge Boston, years ago, about 20-something years ago, told me that I have to read your book about the second inaugural. And all these years I have meant to. I really have. But it's so funny to me that so many years have passed. 2 decades have passed since he wrote that book. That book, we can turn the page a little bit here to Lincoln, because what you're writing about in your book on the second inaugural is about Lincoln's faith. And in your more recent book on Lincoln, A. Lincoln, this magnificent biography, 700 pages, you're writing about Lincoln's whole life, but you're also writing about his faith. So the book on the second inaugural was your first book. So talk about that, because as we're talking about Chamberlain and Chamberlain's magnanimity at Appomattox Courthouse, we remember Lincoln, and I mean, I guess most of us, unless you've read this recently, you forget how bitter this Civil War must have been, how awful it must have been, and how it required profound love and forgiveness just to get through. There's no other way forward. So what led you to say, I'm going to write a book on Lincoln's second inaugural?
I was teaching in the history department at UCLA, and I had the choice of offering a seminar of my choosing. The Huntington Library, the great private library, offered at that moment the greatest Lincoln exhibit ever, bringing things from Springfield, Illinois, and Louise Taper in Beverly Hills, the greatest private collector. And I thought, well, I don't know anything about Lincoln, but I'll bring my students to the exhibit. I'm always trying to find a way to get students engaged. So we read an anthology of Lincoln's speeches and letters, and I came to the second inaugural. I thought, this is remarkable. Well, there were 5 books on the Gettysburg Address. I'll find one on the second inaugural. No one had written on the second inaugural. And yet Lincoln said after he delivered it, this was my best effort. No derogation to the Gettysburg Address, but I think this was his finest address. So I set out to write this book and wondered whether people would take 200 pages to look at 701 words. But in those 701 words, Lincoln mentions God 14 times, quotes the Bible 4 times, and invokes prayer 3 times. So the whole faith story of Lincoln is in that second inaugural. But it's been a very debated story about Lincoln's faith or Lincoln's religion.
Well, let's talk about that, because obviously anybody who reads your 2009 biography, A. Lincoln, we'll see that Lincoln did not exactly start out as a believer, certainly not a standard believer, and he ends up as a profound Christian believer. So, did you know this about his faith when you decided to write the book on the second inaugural? Did you already know this and then decide to write about it?
I did not. I was struck by the second inaugural, and my academic colleagues said, well, don't get too excited. Presidents always reference the Bible in their inaugural addresses. So I said, well, let's read the previous 18 addresses. The Bible had been mentioned one time by John Quincy Adams. So this was quite surprising to that audience. No one quite understood who Lincoln was even at that moment. What I discovered was that 2.5 years earlier, after the Second Battle of Manassas, another devastating defeat for the Union Army, Lincoln, by himself, unknown to anyone else, writes what he often did on a little scrap of paper, something with no title, no date, no signature, but we know it's Lincoln. The will of God prevails. In great contests, each side says they follow the will of God. Both cannot be correct, one must be right, the other wrong. And then Lincoln offers this amazing sentence: it may be that God's purpose is different from the purpose of either party, and yet God uses human efforts to express his will. And a little bit further down, he says, it may be that God could give the victory to either side any day. Are you suggesting he could give the victory to the Confederacy? You would never say that in public. But he concludes by saying, but this is the will of God, and he needs to know more about it. Fortunately, Secretary John Hay found this after Lincoln's death, but no one who heard the Lincoln's second inaugural knew that Lincoln 2.5 years earlier had written this private meditation. He was on a faith journey. You and I are on journeys in our life, and I thought that the average historian didn't give Lincoln any credit for changing his mind about faith. Because as you suggested, in the beginning he was very critical. He didn't like his parents' religion. It was too emotional, the Second Great Awakening. In New Salem, he wrote a little essay criticizing the Bible, and someone ripped it out of his hand and threw it in the fire. Not a smart thing to do for an aspiring politician. But I often say, especially when I'm speaking in churches, that when life tumbles in, and it will for all of us as we age, the death of Eddie at age 3 in 1850, the death of Willie at age 11 in 1862, suddenly Lincoln encounters Phineas Densmore Gurley, the minister of the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church in Washington, the missing person in the story, and his whole trajectory begins to change.
It's extraordinary, and I just want to commend you for telling the story of Lincoln's faith, because we were talking earlier privately, but I thought that much of what I write is similar in the sense that you look at something and you think, they haven't written about this. Why haven't they written about this? And you've encountered this, and it's why you've written much of what you've written, because you find a hole, you find a gap. And both of us know that the academy typically is secular and is uncomfortable with dealing with faith generally, which creates a big problem, because many, many, many figures in history were people of great faith, motivated by faith. If you don't deal with faith, you're really missing history. You can't do history. But people think, well, I don't want to be the one to write about that, or I don't know what I would say about that. So you look into Lincoln, and you, in a sense, you resurrect the real Lincoln for America. Had anyone before you talked about Lincoln's faith in the way that you have?
Well, I don't want to lift myself up in that sort of comparison, but I don't think we've done it in this particular way. There have been one or two people who've talked about Lincoln's awareness that he needed to appeal to religious audiences. That the Protestant churches were very powerful in the 19th century. But that's completely different than saying, but his own personal faith is this. So that's what I was trying to get at. What did he really think? What did he really believe? And in my book, Lincoln in Private, I tell the story of the 111 notes that have still survived. We call them fragments because none of them are titled, none of them are dated, none of them are signed, but they were all written by Lincoln. He's really kind of working out in his own mind his ideas on all the great issues of the day. He never thought we would see any of those 111.
Okay, you have to explain this because I was fascinated by this, that Lincoln had the habit of just jotting things down, very, very thoughtful things, and then sticking them, in the little hole in the desk. I mean, they had desks of that kind, and just putting it there, just filing it away. Filing it away. He did this not knowing whether he would use it again.
And sometimes he came back to it, sometimes he didn't. You and I have written notes, but, sometimes we keep them, He kept them. And nobody knew they existed until after his death.
Okay, so before we get into more of this, we have to go back because it's the same with dealing with Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. You cannot help but be struck in the case of Chamberlain and in the case of Lincoln that you're dealing with geniuses. These are outrageously gifted human beings. We forget, I think, when you say somebody knew fluently 9 languages in the case of Chamberlain, that's not even close to normal. He memorized vast tracts of the Bible and things, committed to memory. He's a genius. Lincoln, similarly, early on, evinces, it can only be called genius. We can talk a minute about his speech to the Springfield Young Men's Lyceum.
Right.
I mean, what is he, 28?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He's 28 years old. I mean, when we think of Lincoln as 28, we think of some dude splitting rails. He gives a speech for the ages. He's 28 years old. And he gives a speech that what strikes me the most about it, I mean, it's pure genius, but what strikes me, and I want to get to this, is that he is such a deep thinker that he is, without Lincoln, the America since Lincoln would not exist. That he was used principally by God, I would say, in helping us figure out what the meaning of America is and who we are. And in this speech in 1838, as a 28-year-old, he's doing that. Talk a little bit about that speech. I mean, you don't quote the whole thing. It's a long speech, but you refer to it in the book, because when you realize that he was capable of this at 28, you begin to understand who you're dealing with.
Well, stepping back just a bit, we must remember that in that particular day, the only education Lincoln received as a boy who had to work with his father on the farm was in January, when it was too cold to work on the farm. And the parents would hire a roving teacher who would come through. So in 5 or maybe 6 Januaries, Lincoln studied 1 month, 1 month, 1 month, 1 month, 1 month. He had less than 1 year of formal education. So he was a self-taught person who wanted to become this educated individual, which he did become. The way he rose was there were other lawyers, there were other veterans of the Black Hawk War, but he would rise by his gift of speaking. And actually, here's an extra credit question. In the grammar of that day, the last half of the book was called declamation. Anybody know what declamation meant? Public speaking. So they would practice reading from the Bible, reading from Shakespeare, reading from Lord Byron. So he signed up for the Young Men's Lyceum, where he would practice becoming a speaker or a debater. And this was his first public speech. Well, what was the problem? He always spoke to a problem. It was violence in America. It was what he called mobocracy. Elijah Lovejoy, the Presbyterian minister in Alton, Illinois, who was publishing an anti-slavery newspaper, was killed in the street by a mob 6 months before he gave the address. So Lincoln then poses, well, what will be the problem that might come to America? Will it be somebody who will cross the Atlantic? No. If the problem arises, it must rise up within us. If we are to die as a nation, we will die by suicide as we turn against each other. It's almost eerie to read this from way back there. And this is the way Lincoln foresaw a future problem for the United States. Just incredible.
Well, it's prophetic. I mean, one of the things that he is also undeniably, he's a prophet.
He is. Yeah.
He doesn't think of himself that way, but it's obvious that he's a prophet, and he has a gift so extraordinary. Yeah, I mean, you see it in that Lyceum speech, but you see it throughout his life. He has a gift for language, a gift for joking,
Yeah, right.
a gift for turns of phrase that is just astonishing. There's no other way to see it. It's an astonishing gift. But I want to talk about his appreciation, because actually it was that speech that led our friend Os Guinness to write his book, A Free People's Suicide, which led me to write my book, If You Can Keep It, about America.
Yeah.
And that idea of what America really is and how we need to keep the republic, how that takes great effort and sacrifice, which again makes me think of Chamberlain. People, you have to have people willing to die for liberty. You have to have people willing to die for what is right and good and true. And if you don't, you lose this glorious experiment in ordered liberty. It goes away. Lincoln sees this in 1838. But part of his genius is his appreciation for the founders. And I always say that I don't know anyone who appreciated the founders, who understood them better than Abraham Lincoln. Where did that come from? Because he really, it's his appreciation of the founders that helps him obviously navigate the Civil War and really remake America in its original image, but remake it slightly differently, but hearkening back to the founders. What was it that gave Lincoln this particular appreciation, if you can say, for the founders?
Well, as a lawyer, and he was a lawyer more than he was a politician, 24 years as a lawyer, 14 years as a politician, he was interested in precedent. This is my suggestion. So he loved George Washington. He read Parson Weems' biography of Washington. He loved Jefferson. He was invited to a big celebration of Jefferson's after Jefferson's death in Boston. He wanted to go but couldn't, but he commended Jefferson. But he had this other line that I just love. He worried that what he called, his line was, the silent artillery of time is taking away all the persons who were the revolutionary generation. And if that silent artillery of time took them away, would we lose, therefore, our understanding what they knew, but we no longer know? The grandparents know, but would the children or the grandchildren know what the grandparents knew? This was his great worry, that we'd lose their vision in his own time. Yeah.
Well, again, it's prophetic, but it's also astonishing. This is 1838.
Right.
I mean, he's saying this, or is it 1837? But the point is that he's a young man, and he's worried. In the 1830s, I mean, Tocqueville is, 5 minutes gone, and he's worried about that. And this is nearly 200 years ago. It's astonishing that he sees the problem precisely, and again, his ability as a man in his 20s to use that phrase, the silent artillery of time. It's just amazingly powerful. But he diagnoses it.
Yeah.
But isn't it? It's almost crazy that long ago he perceives this problem. I mean, I guess it was immediate in the sense that there were plenty of people alive who were from the founding generation. And he could see that if you weren't of that generation, you behaved differently.
Yeah.
Kind of like people who remember the Depression or World War II behave differently than people who don't.
Yeah, my parents, right. Yeah. Well, and he also, he understood that one of the great problems was, as we've been suggesting, the lack of understanding of who we were and how we are. And one of the things he did in this regard was when he ran for one term in Congress, 1847 to 1849. And America was involved in the war with Mexico. And he dared to say to the President of the United States, James Polk, tell me the spot where the Mexicans invaded America, because I'm quite convinced it's the other way around. America invaded Mexico, or actually brought the Mexicans in. So suddenly Lincoln was tarred with the phrase, spotty Lincoln, spotty Lincoln.
Well, just to make the point, and I don't know if everybody's clear, that he dares, as a freshman congressman, to call out the President of the United States and to say that you say that we were attacked by Mexico.
Right.
Show me where. And he knows that, in fact, the inciting incident happened in Mexican territory. So if it happened in Mexican territory, obviously it had nothing to do with them attacking us. So, but that's very brave of him. And it sticks with him, but he doesn't get another term.
He doesn't, because he's going against the President of the United States. But what he also says, and this goes back to your earlier comment about the founders, he says to Polk, remember, you sit where George Washington sat, and I expect you to offer the truth as George Washington would have offered the truth. So he goes home, and his constituents say, well, thank you very much. We're not going to elect you again. And he becomes a full-time lawyer, and doesn't believe that perhaps there's any political office out there for him in the future. Yeah.
Amazing. I mean, there's so much that's amazing in both these books. So one thing that sometimes things strike one as funny. His relationship with Stephen Douglas, I can't think of anything more bizarre. I mean, the idea that he knows him very young. One of them is 6'4", the other is
5'4".
5'4". And they are rivals for the longest time, including rivals for the hand of Mary Lincoln.
Mary Lincoln. Mary, not Mary Todd, not Mary Lincoln, right?
But I mean, it's really bizarre when you look at history, because it almost makes it's like somebody is trying to do the movie version. They think, we've got to combine some characters, and we'll make him, the same guy who. But in fact, it's true that he was a rival, and then he ends up running for the Senate with it. It's just kind of
Well, and interesting, they have a real difference of opinion, because Stephen Douglas is arguing for what he calls popular sovereignty, the idea that people in Nebraska and Kansas can vote whether they want to have slavery or not. And Lincoln says, you can vote whether you want to have slavery or not? What are you talking about? And 29 times in the first two debates with Stephen Douglas in 1858, Douglas calls him the Black Republican. The Black Republican, the Black Republican. But sometimes when they traveled, this is hard for a modern audience even to get, they would sleep in the same bed.
I mean, that's the kind of thing that it's astonishing that they're hanging out. They're rivals, but I guess they're not bitter rivals.
No, he says to Douglas, I never doubt Douglas's patriotism. He loves this country. Can you imagine that? I never doubt his patriotism.
So in 1858, that's when he loses the Senate race.
He loses the Senate race, and really, it's really all based on gerrymandering, because if you add up the popular vote, he had more popular votes than Douglas, but it was voted by, representatives in the House and Senate, and by gerrymandering, the Democrats had more votes than the Republicans, so that's the only reason he lost.
So the Democrats were cheating even then. Not that I'm only joking. Of course, I'm only joking. And the Democrats are, of course, pro-slavery. And we're in the Union League Club. I mean, I have to say, this club would not exist if not for the events which we're discussing.
Yes. Yeah.
So Lincoln loses, quote unquote, loses to his rival, and he writes something. He writes, I am glad I made the late race. I'm glad I ran, even though I lost. It gave me a hearing on the great and durable question of the age, which is, of course, slavery and states' rights, which I could have had in no other way. And though I sink out of view and shall be forgotten, I believe I have made some marks which will tell for the cause of civil liberty long after I am gone. It's sort of funny to me that the two things that Lincoln flat out gets wrong in 1858, when he stupidly says, I'm out of here, you're not going to hear from me again. And then famously in the Gettysburg Address, you can quote the line,
Right. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. Lincoln was a master of the negative. That's an interesting grammatical twist. He uses the negative many, many, many times. It's a strange way to talk, but it's very powerful.
Well, talk about the way that he talked, because there's a lot of that in this book. As I said, he was outrageously gifted as a speaker. I mean, he comes up with phrases. I mean, you quote him here and there, but you think, where in the world did he get that from? He has a powerful mind, a powerful imagination.
Well, and he did something that we no longer do. He really believed we should read with two senses, the sense of the eye, which is the way we read, and the sense of the ear. In the 19th century, everybody read out loud. I spent 1 year in my 20s in England, and I remember traveling and stopping in a lodge, and people were all sitting around in kind of a large area, and people were reading out loud. And I've tried to figure out when was the day, it might have been in the 1920s, and it was 110 degrees in Phoenix, Arizona, and the teacher said, Johnny, you're disturbing Mary, read to yourself. So you and I all read to ourselves. Now, one thing I think some of us have discovered is listening to audiobooks. There's something quite different listening to an audiobook than reading a book. Both are valuable. So Lincoln had a great sense for the sound of words. He could use alliteration. He could use various grammatical devices. And what I learned was that often when he would be writing these speeches, his secretaries have said this, he would speak it out loud before he wrote it on a piece of paper. He wanted to hear, his secretary said he didn't think of himself as a great writer. He thought of himself as a great speaker. There is a difference between speaking and writing, and he knew how to speak to an audience.
Well, you say, I mean, you sort of just said it, but just to be clear, that he would go to his law office and read the newspapers always out loud.
Out loud.
I mean, that's something literally no one does, that he'd be sitting there reading it out loud.
Yeah. And he also, there was no amplification, but I figured out by looking at the various newspaper reports, he spoke very slowly. You and I speak about 150 words a minute. He spoke about 110 words a minute. I think if he had, I suggest if he had an alternative career, he would have liked to have been a Shakespearean actor. He went to Ford's Theater 10 times, including the last time. He loved acting, and he loved Shakespearean actors. And so he was proud of his gift of being a great public speaker.
I mean, I think it speaks to the erosion of the culture that Shakespeare was so popular in, well, not just in the 19th century, but in the early parts of the 20th century. And it seems to me that most people today, including supposedly educated people, can hardly read Shakespeare.
That's right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and today we have the teleprompter, which I think is a very different way of speaking than speaking to an audience where I'm watching you and seeing your response and the way you are responding or not responding. And that has something to do, and Lincoln would do that. He could gauge the way the audience was responding to what he was saying.
There's a line, I guess it's his first inaugural, where he talks about the mystic chords of memory.
Yeah.
That's one of the most powerful things I've ever read, and it's just struck me. It's stuck with me forever. He says the mystic chords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every heart and hearthstone, all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be by the better angels of our nature. A speechwriter didn't write that.
But there's a story, Eric, behind that.
Yes, I'm hoping you get to that. And there's a portrait behind that wall of William Seward, who's prominently featured in the story.
So Lincoln writes out he always edited. He was a great rewriter. I used to say to my students, there's no such thing as good writing. There's only good rewriting. So he would write the first inaugural. He showed it to several Illinois friends who offered a phrase or two. He gets to Washington, and he shows it to William Seward, who had been his chief rival for the presidency, who he persuaded to become Secretary of State. They went to St. John's Episcopal Church on Sunday. They had lunch together. He showed him the address. He said, if you have a few comments, I'd appreciate it. Monday evening, there's a knock on his door at Willard's Hotel. It's Seward's son. He said, my father has read your address, and he has some comments. 7 pages of comments in red. 57 suggestions on how Lincoln can make the speech better. And at the end, Seward says to him, now, as for your last paragraph, forget it. Doesn't work. I've written 2 new last paragraphs. You may choose which one you'd like to use. So he chooses a paragraph, and I show in the book how he takes Seward's words on one column and his words on another one, and he makes Seward's words, his words are so much better than Seward. The idea is there, but the contrast is often better, it's briefer, it's more alliterative, what you just read. But he took Seward's words. So at the Gettysburg Address, Seward has now become Lincoln's fan. He wasn't at first. He thought he was better than Lincoln, and finally, 6 weeks in, Seward writes to his wife, Lincoln is the best. Seward writes to his wife, Lincoln is the best of all of us. So at the Gettysburg Address, after it's over, a woman comes up to her and said, I know that you helped Lincoln write that Gettysburg Address, because she knew the story. He said, no, madam, only Abraham Lincoln could write that address. Wow, because Seward was a great speaker. He was a renowned speaker, but he knew he couldn't measure up to Lincoln. Quite a story.
I mean, measuring up to Lincoln is like trying to measure up to Isaiah or somebody. It's unbelievable. It's just really unbelievable. I have to ask you about, you can't read a biography of Lincoln and read about the Civil War without, if you're paying attention, without being annoyed at McClellan.
Yes.
I cannot get over how awful McClellan was, at least in my opinion, but I'm also astonished that Lincoln allowed General McClellan to get away with what he did. Talk a little bit about that, about how Lincoln eventually realizes he needs to step in, but it took a long time and a lot of blood.
Well, George McClellan was a young man in his 30s when Lincoln gave him command of the Union armies. And McClellan writes a letter to his wife and says, well, everybody knows I'm the best there is. Nobody can compare to who I am. They called him the Little Napoleon. And he had a huge, huge ego. He didn't have a house out where the troops were. He had this big, grand house in Washington, D.C. And he was good at preparing his men and overestimating the enemy, but not fighting. So one evening, this is the famous story to which I think you're thinking, Lincoln and Stanton come to visit McClellan. And when they arrive, Mrs. McClellan says, well, the general's not home yet, but you can sit here in the parlor. McClellan enters the front door, doesn't see them at all, walks up the stairs and goes to his bedroom. And Stanton says to Lincoln as they walk home, how in the world can you deal with a man like that? He said, I will hold General McClellan's horse if he will lead us to victory. So I think Lincoln understood that the men did appreciate McClellan. We can fault Lincoln for not firing him sooner, but I think he knew that whatever McClellan's fault was, he had quite a following among the Union Army, and that may be the reason he stayed with him so long, probably too long.
Definitely too long.
Too long.
I mean, it's amazing to me when you read about it. It's just extreme. Look, the arrogance of McClellan could not be more off-putting. Amazingly arrogant young man, horrifyingly arrogant. The idea that Lincoln was so humble in a way in dealing with him. One of the things about Lincoln's humility, I probably lost the page here, but he understands his limits. And in other words, he understands in his first inaugural where he's talking about, okay, we're facing the Civil War, and he's making the point that the government will not interfere. Mm-hmm. In other words, he understands that I am bound by the Constitution. I'm not bound by what's right. I'm bound by what's right and by the Constitution as well. So I cannot simply by fiat declare whatever I'd like to declare,
right?
Which leads us to the Emancipation Proclamation. What changed such that Lincoln felt that he could go beyond where he had been and issue the Emancipation Proclamation? And God's hand, it seems to me, figures in that.
Well, the first inaugural to which you're referring takes place before Fort Sumter. And in a sense, he's saying the government will not assail you. If there is to be war, it will be you that will assail the government, which is exactly what takes place.
Speaking to the South.
Speaking to the South. But then, as he absolutely important to understand, he did not start the Civil War to do away with slavery. He did not believe he had the right under the Constitution to do so. He started that war to preserve the Union. But as he moved forward, and he had to keep the 4 border states in, he often said, I'd like to have God on my side, but I need Kentucky. But then he offered to the border states the idea that they could emancipate their slaves all the way up to 1895. 1895.
He makes this offer.
He makes this offer, and we'll pay for you because you think they're your property and you're going to lose something economically. All right, we'll pay you to emancipate your slaves. But when they just say, no, he understands that the meaning of freedom for this country now, which Jefferson had written in the Declaration of Independence, must be expanded. And now it must include freedom for African Americans. And that becomes the Emancipation Proclamation, in which he says, as he signs it with a trembling hand, if I'm to be remembered for anything, it will be for signing the Emancipation Proclamation. He understands the gravity of what he's about to do, and he's deeply criticized for it by many, many people signing that Emancipation Proclamation.
Well, you say he signed it. What's interesting, the title of your book is A. Lincoln, not Abraham Lincoln,
right?
Because he always signed everything A.
Lincoln.
Mm-hmm. But not the Emancipation
Proclamation, Abraham Lincoln. And I put A. Lincoln because there were no addresses on streets at that time. So he simply had this little silver plate on the door of his home in Springfield that said A. Lincoln.
So the Emancipation Proclamation, he also decided that he wouldn't issue it unless they won some victory. He was really putting out what Christians would call a fleece before God. So what was that battle?
Well, he had been told by Seward that you have to win a battle you can't look like you're doing this out of weakness. There has to be some sort of strength. So a battle takes place in September of 1862. He then offers a version of the Emancipation Proclamation, and he signs it on January 1st, 1863. Yeah.
But it was because they had won the battle.
At Antietam. Actually, it was a kind of a mixed bag. I mean, he sort of won it, but it wasn't a decisive victory. But they sort of claimed the victory and said, okay, now we could go forward with the Emancipation Proclamation. Yeah.
In the few minutes we have left, I want to go back to Lincoln's faith. Yes. There's no doubt when you read the second inaugural, this is a man of profound faith. It's one thing to say he had faith. He's a man of profound faith. He's so motivated by faith that he's thinking along those lines. It's not just that he's adding something in a speech to speak to the religious people in the audience, but it's clear that at his core are these issues. You say that part of that had to do with the death of
Willie.
Of Willie, who was 11 years old.
Mm-hmm. And the point I would make then, to put this into the larger perspective, is when Lincoln wrote this critique of the Bible, or what he called revealed religion in New Salem, when he's a very young man, it's tossed in the fire, he becomes what's known as a fatalist. It's kind of a kissing cousin of deism. If there's a God, it's kind of a watchmaker God, but a God who doesn't really enter into the affairs of people. And most of the historians, maybe almost all of them, have said, well, there's a direct line of determinism from fatalism to Lincoln's What God Wills. But then I discovered this book by an Episcopal clergyman who became one of the first professors of the new Episcopal Seminary in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And he said, no, fatalism wasn't a part of faith. It was actually a heresy because it denied the providence of God, that God is a God of personality who loves human beings and who acts in the world. So when he listens to Phineas Densmore Gurley, the minister at New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, number one in his class at Princeton Seminary, student of Charles Hodge, I've now read Gurley's sermons at the Presbyterian Historical Society in Philadelphia. It's all about providence. It's no longer fatalism. The second inaugural is about providence. God acts in history. And so we say today all inaugural addresses must include a quotation from the Bible, right? But it's usually in the last paragraph, and we need God's help too. No, in Lincoln's address, it's right in the center of the address. It's part and parcel of what it's all about. He's thinking not simply as the Bible as literature, but in a very theological way about the purposes and meaning of God. Yeah.
The cadences of the Gettysburg Address, I mean, the fact that he says 70 years ago, again, there's nothing else to call it but genius. But it comes from the Bible. It's helping us process through a biblical lens.
Sure. Well, and again, the way that Lincoln rethinks what he's doing, about 10 months earlier, there'd been people would come to the White House, he'd give a talk, and he said something to the effect of, what was it, 10 or 12 years ago that we, in the Gettysburg Address, that same sentence becomes 77 years ago. So Lincoln was an editor of his own words.
Actually, I found the very page. He asks, how long ago is it? 80 odd years since on the 4th of July, for the first time in the history of the world, a nation. But even this, I mean, his appreciation, I mean, because we're just talking about the 80 odd years versus 77 years ago. But he says, how long ago is it? 80 odd years since on the 4th of July, for the first time in the history of the world, a nation by its representatives assembled and declared as a self-evident truth that all men are created equal. He understands
he does.
the revolutionary ideas behind the revolution.
Well, he understands that the Declaration is really the radical founding document, and the Constitution then is what we need. We need to have a Constitution, but the Declaration is what's really important.
So, but that's what we were talking about earlier, is the idea is that Lincoln, what would you call it? I mean, he is doing exegesis. He is interpreting things forever. That our interpretation today is because of Lincoln's interpretation then.
Exactly. Well
he made
said.
it possible for us today to understand what America is. It hadn't been properly understood. And he, in his genius, reaches back to the Declaration. We think, well, so what? But you make it clear in the book, well, that was not normal. People would go back to the Constitution. But he goes back to he makes this leap that this is where it began.
Yeah.
All men are created equal. These are these ideas that are seminal.
And I was surprised to find that the Declaration was not very much in currency. People were aware of its founding document separating us from Great Britain, but the whole idea that this would then be a reforming document, that, we were not perfectly formed in 1788 or 1792. We're still not perfectly formed, but the Declaration is the lens by which we can move forward and keep reforming our nation. He understood that. He didn't go as far. He was a 19th century person. He wasn't thinking about women, sadly. He was thinking about bringing African American men into this conversation. And he believed, whether he was right or not, that Jefferson wanted to include all persons, all men in that. But Lincoln was when I say to audience, I want to say Lincoln was a 19th century person. You know, he can't help us with what to do in Ukraine. He wasn't thinking about climate change. But I think he's one of those very few people who's a transcendent figure. He still speaks to us in 2024, and many other great historical figures which we need to study and know about no longer speak to us in 2024.
Well, he's a giant. There's no doubt about it. I can't help but think that he was aware that he was an instrument in God's hands.
Yes.
It seems that he knew this, but it even seems that he knew this leaving Springfield.
He did.
When he makes that statement.
Amazing. He arrives finally in Trenton, New Jersey, speaking to the state legislature there, and he says to them, I wish to be a humble instrument in the hands of the Almighty and this almost chosen nation. Oh, I wish I could ask him, what did you mean by almost chosen nation? What a phrase, almost. He believes it's a chosen nation, but it's an almost chosen nation. That's just incredible.
Well, I think he doesn't want, he doesn't want to compare it to Israel, really.
Right.
But he's still making the point that providence is inescapably central in the formation and the continuance of the United States of America. He understood that, and he wasn't shy about it.
No, he wasn't shy about it. No.
Just as he's leaving Springfield, I can't remember where he says it.
Right.
But that he says, with a task greater than Washington.
Yes.
That seems uncharacteristic of Lincoln in the sense that because he knew of the greatness of Washington, to make that statement, why do you suppose he said that?
Well, he's not saying I'm greater than Washington. He's saying the task is greater. And I had this great experience some years ago. The State Department contacted me by telephone and said, would you be willing to go and speak in Germany? This was right in the midst of after the war in Iraq. He said, people have been staying away from United States embassies because they disagree with our policy in Iraq. We think there's an opportunity now. So I was speaking at the Free University in Berlin, and I'm sitting at dinner in an Italian restaurant in Berlin, and a graduate student is sitting next to me, and he said, I love Abraham Lincoln. He said, could I say to you that this is what we're referring to, the farewell address at Springfield? Could I say it to you from memory? So he said it to me from memory in a second language, English. He was a German graduate student. I thought, wow, do we know too many Americans who know the farewell address at Springfield from memory?
And to do it in an Italian restaurant, that is astonishing. The end of Lincoln's life, it seems in retrospect fitting that he is murdered. Talk a little bit about that, because the idea that he was killed on Good Friday, it's hard if you believe in God, which not everyone does, but if you do, and then you think of Lincoln's belief in God, which was just so unbelievably profound at the end of his life, the last few years, the idea that he's killed on Good Friday. What do you suppose, because it's hard for us to imagine had he lived, what do you suppose it does? Does it, there were so many of those kind of maudlin illustrations of him, floating up to be greeted in Elysium by Washington. You could picture them, but it instantly puts him in the company of Washington.
It does. Well, and there's no doubt that we view Lincoln as we view others, John F. Kennedy or Martin Luther King, through their martyrdom. And what would have happened if he had lived? He had won a decisive victory for re-election. Gamblers in the street were actually betting he would serve a third term. There were no term limits, but would have been a difficult time. I mean, what's really surprised me was that a number of Republican senators were actually almost glad that he was dead, because he was too soft on the South. He was too much of a reconciler. They wanted to punish the South for what they had done. And they didn't appreciate Lincoln's magnanimity. But he had that sense both of his stature and his magnanimity. No one else. Obviously, Andrew Johnson was a terrible failure as president. Ulysses S. Grant tried to lift up the mantle of Lincoln, but there was no one like Lincoln, and Grant was the first person to tell you that.
Well, I guess that's a good place to end. It's very frustrating to me that we have to end, but you are bringing up the subject of your biography, Ulysses S. Grant, reminds me that we can do this again.
Good.
And we can talk about Grant and all of them, the bum McClellan. The idea that McClellan ran against Lincoln in 1864, I mean, that's at least tacky. It's at least tacky. But I look forward to talking with you more. Very grateful, Dr. Ronald C. White, for not just your scholarship, but for your books, wonderful books. I do look forward to talking to you about more of them, but for now, we'll simply say thank you very much.
Thank you for the privilege.